What surprised me most was his identification papers. The papers were dated 1958, but they were like new. There was a photograph that looked similar to this man, but I didn't see how it could be him. I assumed this person was out of his mind and had to get him to a psychiatrist.
Number 1, the Louisiana time slip. In the quiet Louisiana town of Abbeville, two men named LC and Charlie embarked on what seemed to be a routine business trip. It was October 20th, 1969, a picture-perfect day with the sun shining and a crisp breeze accompanying them as they drove north on Highway 167 toward Lafayette. The highway stretched out ahead of them, eerily empty, the absence of other vehicles adding to the stillness of the moment. As the two chatted about their new business venture, their attention was suddenly drawn to a peculiar sight ahead, a slow-moving vehicle. As they got closer, they realized it was an old turtleback-style car, something straight out of the 1940s. The vehicle's dated appearance wasn't the only oddity. The license plate clearly read 1940, as though frozen in time. Curiosity piqued, LC and Charlie decided to overtake the vehicle. As they pulled alongside, they saw a woman behind the wheel, her attire as vintage as her car. She wore a perfectly tailored 1940s dress, complete with a matching hat and gloves. Next to her sat a young boy, similarly dressed in clothes of the same era. But the most startling detail wasn't their clothing, it was the look of sheer panic on the woman's face as she noticed the two men staring at her. Alarmed, LC rolled down his window and shouted, "Do you need help?" The woman nodded frantically, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. He gestured for her to pull over to the shoulder of the road, and she complied. LC stepped out of his car, his heart pounding with a mix of excitement and unease. But as he approached the woman's car, something inexplicable happened. In the blink of an eye, the vehicle vanished. No screeching tires, no cloud of dust, just gone, as though it had never been there. Stunned, LC turned around and noticed another car pulling up behind him. A man stepped out, his face pale and his voice shaking. "Did you see that car? The old one?" he asked, describing the same details LC and Charlie had just witnessed: the turtleback car, the woman, the child. The man insisted they report the incident to the police, but LC and Charlie declined. How could they explain what had happened without sounding insane? To this day, the strange encounter remains unexplained. Was it a genuine time slip, a brief glimpse into the past, or something else entirely? Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on everyone who witnessed it.
I remember he kept looking at my mobile phone, just staring at it. He didn't want to give me his code or his camera or any of his belongings. I knew he was going to be a difficult patient.
Number 2, the Sergei Ponomarenko story. On a quiet afternoon in Kiev, Ukraine on April the 23rd, 2006, an unusual figure caught the attention of passers-by. A young man, seemingly in his early 20s, stood frozen on the street, staring up at a high-rise building. His clothes, while clean and pressed, looked straight out of a 1950s fashion magazine, something you'd expect to see in a history book, not on the streets of modern Kyiv. He looked lost, anxious, and entirely out of place. When two police officers noticed him wandering aimlessly, they approached to see if he needed help. The man introduced himself as Sergei Ponomarenko and politely asked for directions to a street that didn't exist on any modern map, Peshnaya Street. The officers were puzzled and asked for identification. What they found raised immediate red flags. Sergei handed over an ID issued by the Soviet Union, a state that had ceased to exist in 1991. The document listed his birth year as 1932, which would make him 74 years old. Yet, standing before them was a man who couldn't have been older than 25. His confusion deepened when the officers showed him a current map of Kyiv. He stared at it, baffled, unable to recognize any landmarks. The officers, unsure of what to make of Sergei, escorted him to the station. They noted his peculiar belongings, a vintage Yashica camera hanging around his neck. The camera looked brand new, though it was an antique model no longer in production. At the station, Sergei's behavior grew more erratic. He resisted handing over his camera and belongings, frequently glancing at the modern technology around him as if it were alien. Officers decided to take him to a psychiatric clinic, suspecting he might be mentally unwell. The clinic's CCTV footage shows Sergei pacing nervously in the waiting area, visibly unsettled. When questioned by the psychiatrist, he claimed to have no knowledge of the year 2006. Instead, he insisted it was 1958. Sergei described how he had been out for a walk in Kyiv, carrying his camera, when he noticed a strange object in the sky. He took a photograph of what he described as a UFO, and moments later, everything around him changed. He was adamant that he hadn't traveled far, just down the street, but suddenly the buildings, cars, and people were unrecognizable. To him, it felt as though he had jumped forward in time. The psychiatrist was skeptical but decided to investigate the camera. When the film was developed, the photos stunned everyone. Among the images were clear snapshots of Kyiv as it appeared in the 1950s, complete with historical landmarks and vintage cars. But the most chilling image showed Sergei posing with the Motherland Monument in the background. The problem? That monument wasn't constructed until 1981, over 20 years after Sergei claimed the photo was taken. Sergei remained at the clinic for observation, but just days later he vanished. Surveillance footage showed him walking down a corridor, turning a corner, and never reappearing. It was as if he had stepped into thin air. Searches of the clinic and surrounding areas yielded no trace of him. Investigators revisited the photos Sergei had left behind, trying to piece together the mystery. One photo featured a handwritten note on the back. "Dearest Valentina, everything is fine with me. I'll try to return when I can. Yours, Sergei." This raised even more questions. Who was Valentina? Did she know Sergei's secret, or was she just as clueless as everyone else? Speculation about Sergei's case has ranged from plausible science to outright fantasy. Some suggest he may have slipped through a wormhole, a hypothetical tear in the fabric of space-time. According to Einstein's theories of relativity, time travel is theoretically possible under specific conditions, like traveling at speeds near the speed of light or being near a black hole. Could Sergei have inadvertently stumbled into such an anomaly? Skeptics argue the entire story might be a hoax, pointing out inconsistencies in the timeline and documents. For instance, the CCTV footage shows different dates and times, and Sergei's photos appear suspiciously well preserved for film from the 1950s. Additionally, the documentary about Sergei's case included dramatized scenes, further muddying the waters between fact and fiction. Whether real or fabricated, Sergei's story captivates us because it taps into something universal, our fascination with time. Time governs every aspect of our lives, and yet it remains one of the great mysteries of existence. What if we could rewrite our past mistakes or glimpse the future? Stories like Sergei's remind us of both the limits of our understanding and the boundless possibilities of the unknown. So, was Sergei Ponomarenko a genuine time traveler? Or was he simply a well-crafted illusion? We may never know. But as long as we're drawn to the enigma of time, his story will continue to intrigue and inspire. Number 3. Victor Goddard's mysterious flight through time. Victor Goddard, a seasoned pilot with a reputation for precision and skill, found himself at the center of one of the most perplexing aviation mysteries of the 20th century. It was the 1930s, and Goddard was embarking on a routine flight to Edinburgh. Before taking off, he decided to make a stop at an old, seemingly forgotten military airfield called Drem. At this point, the journey seemed like any other, calculated, uneventful, and predictable, but what unfolded would forever remain etched in his memory. As he approached Drem Airfield, Goddard peered down to assess the landing conditions. To his astonishment, the airfield looked as though it had been abandoned for years. The runways were overrun with grass and weeds, suggesting neglect and disuse. Even more bizarrely, cattle were leisurely grazing and wandering around the area, making it clear that this airfield was far from operational. Realizing the impossibility of landing, Goddard adjusted his course and continued on to Edinburgh, his mind lingering on the strange state of the airfield. Upon reaching Edinburgh without incident, Goddard attended to his business and prepared for his return journey. However, the trip back would prove anything but routine. Shortly after takeoff, he encountered a ferocious storm. The storm was unlike anything he had ever experienced in his career. Thunder roared, lightning flashed, and winds threatened to wrestle control of his aircraft away from him. For what felt like an eternity, Goddard navigated blindly through a thick cloud, his plane rattling violently. Just as despair began to creep in, he burst through the cloud cover, greeted by an impossibly bright light. Relief quickly turned to bewilderment as he looked down at Drem Airfield once again. But this time it was entirely transformed. The once abandoned runways were now clear and pristine, bustling with activity. What truly puzzled Goddard was the sight of airplanes parked on the airfield. These planes were painted bright yellow, a color he had never seen used by the Royal Air Force. Though they bore the familiar RAF insignia, their design and color scheme were completely foreign to him. To add to the enigma, the pilots and personnel at the airfield wore blue RAF uniforms, again something entirely unfamiliar to Goddard. Even more unnerving was the fact that no one seemed to notice his aircraft, despite his low-altitude flyover. It was as though he was invisible, an unacknowledged spectator to a scene out of time. The storm reappeared suddenly, snapping Goddard out of his daze. With no time to think, he plunged back into the tempest. However, this time the storm seemed oddly subdued, and he managed to navigate his way home without further incident. Upon landing, Goddard reported the strange encounter to officials, though his story was met with skepticism. However, years later, his account gained credibility when details began to align with historical events. The yellow planes he had described turned out to be RAF trainer aircraft, introduced into service in 1937, 2 years after Goddard's experience. Similarly, the blue uniforms he had observed became standard RAF attire later in the decade. Drem Airfield itself underwent renovations and modernization shortly after Goddard's flight, becoming an active military base until its eventual closure in 1946. Today, the surrounding area is home to a cattle farm, eerily mirroring the scene Goddard first witnessed during his initial flight. Goddard's experience remains one of the most compelling cases of alleged time slips in modern history. His detailed account and subsequent historical developments have intrigued researchers and skeptics alike, leaving many to wonder if he truly glimpsed a moment from the future. Number 4. The Marcahuasi mystery doctor, Raul Rio Centeno, a renowned investigator of unexplained phenomena in Peru, encountered one of his most baffling cases when a young woman visited his office claiming to suffer from hemiplegia, a condition causing paralysis on one side of the body. At first glance, the case seemed medical in nature, but what unfolded left even the seasoned investigator at a loss for answers. The woman, who appeared to be in her early 30s, had no identification, claiming she had lost her documents. Despite her complaints of paralysis, a CAT scan revealed no abnormalities. Her body appeared entirely healthy, with no signs of trauma or nerve damage. Intrigued, Dr. Raul asked her to recount the events leading up to her condition, and her story was nothing short of extraordinary. The woman explained that she had been camping with friends near the ancient stone forest of Marcahuasi, a place shrouded in mystery and folklore. Late one night, they decided to explore the area under the glow of a full moon. As they wandered through the rocky terrain, they heard faint music carried on the wind. Following the sound, they stumbled upon a small torch-lit stone cabin nestled among the rocks. Through the open doorway, the woman saw people inside, dancing in what appeared to be 17th-century clothing. Intrigued and unafraid, she stepped closer to the cabin, ignoring the sudden chill that swept over her. She described the sensation as an unnatural cold, almost electric, but she brushed it off as she leaned forward and peered through the doorway. Her friends, alarmed by her actions, pulled her back just as she attempted to step inside. It was at that moment that she felt a strange, almost otherworldly sensation. Half of her body suddenly became numb and unresponsive, leaving her partially paralyzed. As Dr. Raoul listened, he couldn't ignore the similarities between her story and local legends about Markawasi. The region is believed by some to harbor a dimensional doorway, an invisible portal connecting our world to another realm. Locals often speak of strange occurrences, unexplained phenomena, and eerie sensations experienced in the area, lending credence to the woman's account. Determined to uncover the truth, Dr. Raoul conducted further tests, including an EEG scan. The results were puzzling. While the woman's brain and blood vessels appeared normal, a small area of tissue showed signs of disrupted electrical activity. It was as though her nerves had been temporarily short-circuited, possibly explaining her partial paralysis. Dr. Raoul theorized that the cabin, or whatever it represented, emitted an unknown form of energy that interfered with the nervous system. This might also explain the cold sensation she had experienced before approaching the doorway, but the deeper mystery lay in what might have happened if she had fully entered the cabin. Would she have been trapped in another time or perhaps another dimension? Number 5. The Utah Mystery Road. On a crisp evening in 1972, 4 students from Southern Utah University were driving back to their dorms in Cedar City after a day trip to Nevada. It was around 10 p.m., and the mood in the car was lighthearted, though tinged with urgency. The girls in the group were anxious to make it back before curfew. The group traveled along Highway 56, a stretch of road infamous among locals for its eerie reputation. Tales of strange sightings and inexplicable phenomena had earned it the nickname the Haunted Highway. But the students, laughing and chatting, paid little mind to the stories, at least not at first. As they drove, the asphalt road beneath them suddenly changed to a bright white cement. The smooth surface gleamed in the moonlight, contrasting starkly with the familiar blacktop they had been on moments before. Their unease grew when the road ended abruptly at the edge of a steep cliff. Confused and increasingly unnerved, the group decided to turn back. But as they retraced their path, the world around them seemed to have shifted. Gone were the familiar landmarks of southern Utah. Instead, they found themselves surrounded by towering red canyon walls and vast fields of grain, terrain they had never seen before, despite being well acquainted with the area. Their confusion turned to fear when they spotted a small roadhouse up ahead. Desperate for directions, they pulled into the parking lot. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating as they stepped out of the car. Their eyes were immediately drawn to 3 humanoid figures standing near the building. The figures were like nothing they had ever seen. Their features were vaguely human, but something about them was off. They were unnaturally tall, with elongated limbs and a strange, almost metallic sheen to their skin. One of the girls let out a scream, breaking the tense silence. The group hurried back to their car, panic setting in. But as they tried to leave, the humanoid figures began pursuing them. Riding on dome-shaped 3-wheeled vehicles, the figures moved with an otherworldly speed, closing the distance between them and the students. The driver floored the gas pedal, the car lurching forward as they fled down the unfamiliar road. Heartbeats thundered in their ears as the landscape around them began to shift once more. The red canyon walls and grain fields faded, replaced by the familiar scenery of Highway 56. When they finally made it back to their dorms, the group was shaken but unharmed. They shared their story with friends and family, but no one could explain what they had experienced. The strange road, the mysterious figures, and the terrifying chase remain a chilling mystery to this day. Number 6. The Vanishing Hotel. In 1979, 2 couples set off on a road trip from France to Spain, eager to explore new sights and enjoy a leisurely vacation. The drive was long, and as night fell, they decided to find a place to rest. Near Montélimar, they began searching for a hotel, but every place they tried was full. Their search eventually led them down an unpaved road, lined with old-fashioned buildings and weathered signs advertising a circus. The area had a peculiar charm, as though they had stepped back in time. They finally stumbled upon a quaint hotel with a vacancy sign. The hotel was unlike anything they had ever seen. There were no phones, no elevators, and the rooms had wooden latches instead of locks. The beds were covered in coarse sheets that felt like canvas, and there were no pillows. Despite the rustic conditions, they were too tired to care. The next morning, they went downstairs for breakfast. The dining area was filled with strange sights: a woman in a turn-of-the-century dress and two police officers in pre-1905 uniforms. The couples exchanged puzzled glances but brushed it off, chalking it up to local customs or historical reenactments. When they went to check out, they were astonished by the bill. It was incredibly cheap, less than 1/10 of what they expected to pay. Grateful but bewildered, they paid the amount and left, planning to return to the hotel on their way back from Spain. However, on their return trip, the hotel was nowhere to be found. They drove up and down the same road, but it was as if the building had never existed. Even stranger, when they developed the photos from their trip, all the pictures of the hotel were missing. The couples were left with more questions than answers. Had they stumbled upon a time slip, a momentary portal to another era, or was it something even stranger? The truth remains elusive, but their story continues to captivate and perplex anyone who hears it. So do you believe that time travel is possible? Let us know in the comments below and subscribe for more content like this.